And Dr. Rachel Adler, I have, I don't want to give away your age, but I have studied you since I was in rabbinical school. And you have been a guide and a teacher for me for so many years, and I'm very grateful. Dr. Adler is the Rabbi David Allenson Professor of Jewish Religious Thought and Professor of Modern Jewish Thought and Feminist Studies at Hebrew Union College in Los Angeles. There's actually a little more information in each of their bios on your sheet, rather than go into their extended biography, because I really think that their conversation will tell you so much more about them than I could. I just want to share with you a story. I had mentioned to them that before I knew they were doing this project together, they were already connected in my mind. Because on 2 different occasions, 2 different students here came to me and unprompted began a conversation that sounded so much the same to me that it forever connected you. And the conversation went like this: I just read the most amazing thing. Oh, really? What was it? And it was, in one instance, something that Dr. Rachel Adler had written, in another instance, something that Dr. Aisha Chaudhry had written. And they said, I'm so inspired to hear, to read, to understand this courageous voice of a woman in my tradition, that I now, this is perhaps an overstatement, but the way I remember it was, I now believe I can do this work, right? So those were such wonderful teacher moments, right, that you get, that I forever associate the 2 of you together as great guides, great lights in the fields that connect deep engagement with religion and our feminist commitments. This is precisely the kind of work that the Center for Jewish, Christian, and Islamic Studies loves to do, to bring people together across religious difference, intersecting our commitments, and finding all of the fertile, challenging ground that is there for us to till, and to discover the many ways in which then that kind of engagement can be taken out into our world to make it a better place, to engage in what my tradition calls tikkun olam, repair of the world. So without further ado, let me turn it over to you. Okay.
Well, hello. I think maybe before I start the presentation part, I should give you a context for how we happen to become writing partners. We belonged to a textual reasoning group studying Jewish and Islamic law. And it ran for several years. And the way it would work is we would get together, and there were these sessions. And every session, there was a Jewish text and an Islamic text, and a Judaic scholar and an Islamic scholar. And the deal was that the Judaic scholar had to present the Islamic text, and the Islamic scholar had to present the Judaic text. This was totally terrifying. And you were paired, the texts were paired, and you were paired with another scholar. And so a way of sort of cheating would be you would ask your partner, can you help me with this text? And we ended up working out some ways that you approach text and approach your own tradition. So that's what this is about tonight. So, what's a tradition? What we mean when we talk about a tradition is the speech acts of a whole web of transmitters, teachers to students and students to their students for as long as the tradition's in good order. The philosopher Alasdair MacIntyre says, a tradition isn't just a set of books or codes or anything like that. A tradition is a conversation, even a bit of a fight. Traditions in good order have conversations that are fluid and vital. And they embody ongoing disagreements. MacIntyre says a living tradition is a historically extended, socially embodied argument about the goods that constitute that tradition. So let's unpack that for a minute. A living tradition is historically extended. It stretches over many generations. It's socially embodied. They're real people living out the various positions in the argument. And what MacIntyre means by goods is what the tradition cares about. When we talk about Jewish tradition or Christian traditions or Islamic tradition, some arguments about the goods would be how to live a good life, or how do we act in accordance with God's will. Now, as you probably noticed, Aisha and I are women. And you perhaps know that in both of our traditions, yes, there was a legal conversation. There was a conversation of tradition. And there certainly were people who were invited into it and even groomed to enter it. That wasn't us. So the question for us always is, how do you join a conversation as participants when that tradition never imagined you as participants? Us, LGBTQ people. Think about it. Here you have this tradition where the past topics and language and categories were framed by interests and experiences that are very different from your own. What does it mean for the conversation when we come into it? And not only that, but to complicate things, what about talking across conversations? If you aren't a member of that congregation, how do you converse with the participants in another conversation? Not easy. Because if we join the conversation, we have to join as the people we really are. We can't sneak in by pretending that we're men. So we and the experiences that we have and the stories that we bring have to be added to the conversation. And often that original breaking into the conversation is kind of traumatic for everybody. The tradition has to allow itself to be challenged by the new categories and experiences that newcomers bring. That's not easy. And for a while, the decibel level is high. And the anxiety level is high. The veterans think, this is going to kill us and it's going to destroy the whole conversation. The new folks think, what did I need this for? Why don't I just walk away? But if they persist, then they all revitalize the conversation for all the participants. And that's how traditions stay alive. So that's what we're trying to do here. We're going to talk to texts as the people we are.
Thank you. So when Rachel and I were working on this project, it's ultimately, we ended up writing a paper about this. What we did was we tried to capture the interfaith conversation that we were having with each other and try to capture the energy, because we were coming from very different spaces, not just from in terms of our traditions, but also generationally. And we definitely noticed all of that at play when we were looking at these two texts together and studying them for an extended period of time together. And so we tried to capture some of the constructive, fruitful conversations we had, but also some of the tensions that we had, the places that we disagreed in this paper. So in this presentation, we're going to perform parts of that for you in terms of this paper. And so read parts of that paper and move back and forth. So it's more like, the paper is like a conversation between us and between our texts that we're going to be studying together. So we'll be doing all of that together with you. So building on what Rachel just said, we, the authors of this chapter, Aisha and Rachel, are ourselves talking our way into conversations in which, as women, we would not have originally been included. We come to the text with our own stakes, our own concerns, our own challenges. We are interested in the living experiences of religious women and in their welfare and dignity. We come with some training in ancient history and in gender theory. Probably our conversation would be much different if we did not share this knowledge and these concerns. Through our learning together, we have come to see how these two traditions differ and what they have in common. We also come as religious people within our two traditions, and so as interested parties. What we are interested in is the space between submission and rejection. So that's something I want you to really keep in mind as we're reading, as we're studying together. And that is the very space in which the conversation which constitutes traditions takes place. So the first text that we're going to read together is the Islamic text. And I would like you, and if you all have handouts, if someone does not have a handout, please make sure you get one, because it'll be difficult to follow this conversation if you don't have one. So this is an Islamic legal text that's drawn from a work called Al-Mukhtasar, and it's penned by Abu al-Hussein Hassan Ahmed bin Muhammad bin Ahmed bin Jafar bin Hamdan al-Baghdadi al-Quduri. So for the rest of this presentation, we will call him al-Quduri, because I will not expect you to remember the rest of his name. And he was writing in Iraq in the 11th century. So this is a text that he wrote in the 11th century, and it's an important legal text that had considerable influence in one of the four major Sunni schools of law. So I'm not going to go into greater detail about that at the moment, but the point is that it's an influential text. And the text is about the role of the guardian in the marriage of a minor, and whether he needs the consent of the girl that he's marrying off. So I'm going to read the text for you, and then we read the text together, and then I will discuss how we're going to unpack it. So the marriage of a free, adult, sane woman is or should be contracted with her consent, whether or not a guardian contracts her marriage. According to Abu Hanifa, this is the case regardless of whether she is a virgin or deflowered but unmarried. The two, Abu Yusuf and Muhammad, said, the marriage cannot be contracted without a wali, or a guardian. It is not permissible for the wali, guardian, to coerce an adult, sane virgin in marriage. If the wali asks for her permission and she is silent, or laughs, or cries without sound, that is indicative of her permission. But if she refuses, he cannot marry her. If he asks a thayyib, or the thayyib as you saw above, is the unmarried woman. So, but if she refuses, so let's see, where I lost my place. Okay. If he asks a thayyib, there is no question that her consent must be verbal. If her virginity was removed by jumping, or menstruation, or an injury, or spinsterhood, then the law of virgins applies to her. If her virginity was removed by fornication, then according to Abu Hanifa, she is in the same category. And the two, may God have mercy on them, said that she is under the ruling of the of the married woman. If the husband says to the virgin, the marriage proposal reached you and you remain silent, and she says, no, I refused it, her word takes precedence, and there is no oath due on her. There is no extraction of oath in marriage according to Abu Hanifa, but Abu Yusuf and Muhammad said oaths are extracted in it. The marriage is contracted in the language of betrothal, marriage, transference of ownership, gifting, and charity. It is not contracted in the language of leasing, hiring, and free contract. The marriage of a minor male or female is valid if the wali marries them off, whether the minor girl is a virgin or not, so long as the wali is an agnate. If two minors were married off by the father or grandfather, then they do not have a choice after reaching maturity. But if other than the father or grandfather married them off, then each of them has the choice when they reach adulthood. If they wish, they may uphold the marriage contract, and if they wish, they may annul it. And the slave, the minor, insane, and the disbeliever cannot be guardians to Muslim women. So this is a very interesting, very rich, fascinating text. And one of the things that this text alerts us to is the fact that although women were not part of the legal conversation, they were not participants in the legal conversation, they were regularly discussed. So they were often the subject of the conversation without being participants in it. Now, one of the ways that Muslim scholars would, in the medieval period, would unpack these texts is that they would sort of take these like very complicated, dense texts and make them accessible for practitioners, is that they would unpack these texts by doing a question and answer format with the text. So instead of providing the text, they would sort of structure the text, so they would ask the questions that the text is then answering. So they would say, for example, can a woman represent herself in marriage? What does the text say? Right? So they would sort of go through and do that. Now what I find, I was looking at one of the explications of this text that was organized in this way. And as I was looking at it, it was from the 13th century. And as I was looking at it, I realized this question and answer format for unpacking a text is very fascinating, because the questions that this 13th century author is asking from, a scholar is asking of this 11th century text, are not the questions that I think that the text is answering. So I would ask different questions. So I thought, well, you know what if I went through this entire text and tried to unpack it by asking the questions that I would ask of the text, and then add my commentary on the side. And so I did that. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to unpack this text for you, and I'd like you to read along this, with me, and see what the questions are that are arising for me, and the ways that I answer them, and my commentary on the side, and I'll indicate to you what each of those are. And as you're reading along with me, think about what questions arise for you in your mind when you are reading this text. Am I asking the questions that you think that the text is asking and answering, or am I asking different questions? So maybe sort of take notes about that, and that's something we can discuss in the discussion period after we finish. So first, for me, this is how we start. So question: can a woman represent herself and her interests when contracting a marriage, or must she be represented by her guardian? The text answers, on this point, there is disagreement. Abu Hanifa believed that a woman could marry herself without a guardian, but Abu Yusuf and Muhammad believed that a woman cannot marry herself and must be represented by a guardian. So there's a difference of opinion that the text has. And my commentary on this is, what conception of womanhood makes the question of a woman's legal capacity to represent herself possible? Why would her legal capacity to represent herself be questioned at all? Why isn't her legal capacity assumed? So next question. Can a woman be coerced into marriage? The text answers, it depends. She may not be coerced into marriage if she is a free, adult, and sane woman. So my commentary on this is, this question suggests that women who do not fit these categories, namely slaves, minors, and insane women, may be coerced into marriage. Must a free, adult, and sane woman consent to her marriage? The text answers, yes, she must consent to her marriage. Okay, so what are the ways in which a free, adult, and sane woman might express her consent? It depends, the text answers. If she's a virgin, then she may express her consent in 3 ways. 1, silence. 2, laughter. 3, crying without sound. However, if she is deflowered but unmarried, a thayyib, then she must express her consent verbally. So my commentary on this is, would this not suggest that refusal must be verbal? If so, this would require a great deal of courage and independence from a woman. The framing question of this text suggests that a woman would not have this independence to begin with, since her legal capacity to represent herself is contested. Also, it is counterintuitive to argue that crying without sound counts as consent. In what world is this not seen as more likely a sign of distress or anguish? Laughter can express consent, but also sarcasm. Finally, how do we know that someone is a virgin? These are the things that arise for me. So the text continues. Can a guardian force a free, adult, sane woman into marriage if she refuses a marriage proposal? The text answers, no, she cannot be coerced into marriage. Her guardian must accept her decision. My commentary on this is, of course, if she refuses a marriage, then she has to go home with a guardian who has a great deal of power over her and could make her life very difficult. Question. Speaking of the deflowered but unmarried woman, what are the ways in which a woman might lose her virginity? The text answers, a woman can lose her virginity in 5 ways. Jumping, menstruation, injury, spinsterhood, and fornication. Now this has a little bit of a more extended commentary. Is the deflowered unmarried woman necessarily a divorcee or a widow? It appears not, since the list of ways a woman can lose virginity does not include marriage, though it does include fornication. This casual mention of fornication is confounding and potentially helpful for women who can claim loss of virginity through menstruation, jumping, or injury rather than fornication. In this case, they have a bit more power over the narrative of their virginity, which nevertheless remains a matter of public concern. In what ways can a woman lose her virginity before marriage? Fornication is listed casually as one of the ways in which a woman can lose virginity, alongside jumping, menstruation, injury, and spinsterhood. Why is there no discussion of the had punishment of 100 lashes being applied to a woman who fornicates? Either this corporal punishment is not relevant here, why not? Or is it expected that a woman would survive the punishment and be married? Why or how is spinsterhood a means of losing one's virginity? Is virginity restricted by age? Can older women not be virgins? What is the connection between age and virginity? While 3 activities on the list, jumping, injury, and fornication, are connected to the loss of a hymen, menstruation and spinsterhood are not hymen-related events. What connection does a hymen have to the concept of virginity here? Okay, so question, going back to the text now. Question, if a woman lost her virginity through fornication, does she have to verbally consent to her marriage? The text answers, on this point, there is disagreement. Abu Hanifa believed that, like the virgin, she does not have to verbally consent to her marriage. However, Abu Yusuf and Muhammad believed that fornication put her in the category of the thayyib, and therefore she must verbally consent to her marriage. So commentary. So according to Abu Hanifa, the female fornicator is different from the deflowered but unmarried woman, the thayyib, through lack of control over her person, such that she might be married without her consent. And Abu Yusuf and Muhammad grant her greater control over herself, because she is required to verbally consent to her marriage. It seems that these scholars disagree with regard to the value of the experience gained through fornication. For Abu Hanifa, this experience does not put a woman in the category of the thayyib, but the question is, why? Is it because there is an assumption that her fornication might be a sign of her guilelessness, and thus she needs the protection of her male guardian to oversee her interests in arranging her marriage? Or is this a punishment for the woman who fornicates, that she gets treated like a virgin? And why do Abu Yusuf and Muhammad grant the female fornicator agency in her marriage? Is it because her sexual experience makes her a capable agent over arranging her own marriage? Question. If there is a disagreement about the issue of consent after a couple has been married, where a husband claims that his wife consented to the marriage proposal through silence, and a wife claims that she refused the marriage, then whose claim takes precedence? The text answers, in this case, the wife's claim takes precedence. Interesting that here the discussion is limited to a contested claim about a woman's consent based on silence alone, and not on her laughter or crying. Question, can there be extracted oaths in marriage? Answer, at this point there is disagreement. Abu Hanifa believed that there could be no extraction of oaths in marriage, while Abu Yusuf and Muhammad, who seem to agree on everything, believed the oaths could be extracted in marriage. Question, what is the nature of a marriage contract? Is it more like a sale or lease? What language is appropriate for it? Answer, language appropriate to use in a marriage contract is that of betrothal, marriage, transference of ownership, gifting, and charity. The language of leasing, hiring, and free contract are unsuitable for marriage contracts. So marriage is more like the transference of ownership from the male guardian to the husband, rather than a loan or lease, where there is an expectation of profit for the original owner after use. Can a guardian marry off a virgin or a thayyib minor? Yes, he can, so long as he is an agnate. So my commentary to this is, what is it about an agnate that makes it less likely that he will take advantage of a minor? Or is there some other reason that an agnate guardian has power over minors that other guardians do not? Question, can minors be married against their will and without their consent? Answer, it depends. Question, can two minors who were forced into marriage seek to nullify their marriage once they come of age? Answer, it depends on who the guardian was who arranged their marriage. If their marriage was arranged by their father or paternal grandfather, agnate, then minors cannot nullify their marriage. However, if anyone else contracted their marriage, then each party can choose to nullify or uphold the marriage contract. My commentary, this does not mean that the couple cannot divorce, only that the marriage cannot be nullified. Remember, a husband is still allowed to divorce his wife at all times. Question, what categories of people are unsuitable for guardianship for Muslim women? Answer, slaves, minors, the insane, and the disbelievers. My commentary, women are implicitly included in this list since they cannot be guardians. It is interesting to think about them in the category of slaves, minors, insane, and disbelievers. What qualities do these people share that make them incapable of being guardians? Okay. Turning it over to Vicky.
All right, can you hear me, or do I have to turn this thing on? Oh, I was? All right, okay. Okay, so the Jewish legal text that we're going to look at is a number of centuries earlier than the text that Aisha just read. Her text was 11th century, early 11th century. What I am going to work with you on is a text from the Mishnah, which was originally transmitted orally and was written down about 200 CE under the supervision of Rabbi Yehuda Natsi in Roman Palestine. And the particular Mishnah we're going to look at is from Tractate Ketubot, which deals with marriage arrangements, and the marriage document that's called the Ketubah. The plural is Ketubot. And in this document, the economic contracts of the marriage are recorded. The husband has to settle a sum of money on the wife, which she receives at his death or in case of divorce for any reason other than adultery. And there's a lien on all the husband's property that funds this settlement. So this ketubah makes it much harder for the husband to divorce a woman because it would be expensive for him. He can't just kick her out unprovided for when he's done. During this period, 200 CE, thereabouts, all marriages of young girls were arranged by a father or guardian. And our Mishnah, and this is important to remember because it doesn't say in the Mishnah, Our Mishnah applies to girls in the category of Ketana, that is a minor under the age of 12, or in the category of Na'ara, between 12 and 12 and a half, and presumed to be entering puberty. And that seems to be when most girls were married. So a young woman who was over 12 and a half, and the Hebrew term is bogeret, had to consent to marriage. She had to consent, and she herself received the espousal money, and she received the monetary settlement in her ketubah if she was divorced or the husband died. And because a minor, a ketana or a na'ara, would have most likely returned to her father's house if her husband died or she was divorced, he received the ketubah money. If she was married as a ketana or a na'ara, but at the time of the divorce or the death, she was an adult, then she received the money. So here's the legal text. And here's what I'm going to do. You look at the version that you have on the handout, and I'm going to read you my translation. A father has rights over his daughter regarding her espousal, whether by money, deed, or by intercourse, all modes of espousal. He has a right to whatever she finds, to the work she produces, and to annul her vows. And he receives the monetary settlement provided for in her bill of divorce. But he does not enjoy the usufruct of property that she owns during her lifetime. When she is wed and the marriage consummated, her husband has more entitlements than the father. For he, the husband, can use the usufruct of her property during her lifetime, but he is liable for her maintenance, for her ransom, and for her burial. Rabbi Judah says, even the poorest man in Israel may not provide less than 2 flutes and 1 elegy singer. So, I've done a little explication and also some questions a la Aisha. Our Mishnah is concerned about the comparative entitlements of fathers and husbands regarding daughters and wives. And in the case of the fathers, the emphasis is on the economic rights that the father has over the daughter. Now you need to know that marriage at this time was a 2-stage process. First, the bridegroom singled the girl out as his chosen wife. The Hebrew term is erusin. There's a scholar who uses the term emshin for it. It's sort of like he chooses her, he makes a down payment on her and puts her in escrow. Right? And then, but then, actually, he's committed. He's committed. It's not just betrothal. Because if he wants out, he has to give her a divorce, even though the marriage hasn't been consummated. In the second stage of the marriage, which is called nisuin, that's when the marriage is consummated, and usually it's a year or more after this espousal period. And that's when the girl leaves her family and resides with her husband. So the rabbis gave this stage, Erusin, a new name. They called it Kiddushin, from the root Kof Dalid Shin, to be holy or to be set apart as holy. And there were 3 ways of effecting this first stage of marriage. So the first one was, you could effect it by having a transfer of money or something worth money from the bridegroom to the bride's father, if she was a minor or a na'ara in this 12 to 12 and a half stage. If she's an adult, it has to be directly to her. Alternatively, the bridegroom could write a deed attesting that he's acquiring this woman and give it to the father. Alternatively, there could be sexual intercourse for the sake of establishing marriage. The rabbis recognize this as effective, but they just hate it. They don't want anybody to do it that way. So, the father's entitled to anything that the girl finds. And at this stage, also, children were involved in whatever the family produced. They helped farm, they wove or made rugs or other kinds of productive labor. And also, if the girl was divorced when she's still a minor or a na'ara, then the father gets that financial settlement. But if she owned property that she inherited from one of her mother's relations, the father can't use the usufruct in her lifetime. So let's go to some of these questions. Why can't the daughter contract her own marriage? Because if she's a minor or a na'ara, 12 to 12 and a half, she doesn't have that legal power. Indeed, she doesn't even have to consent. So next question, why is it permissible to marry off little girls? Well, today we would call that childhood sexual abuse, but it was very common in that culture, in all the cultures of that area. And in the later layer of the Talmud, the Gemara, which was compiled between 300 and 550, there are several influential authorities who don't approve of this. Here, I'll quote you one. Rabbi Judah said in the name of Rav, one may not give up one's daughter for espousal as a minor. Rather, she should grow up and say, I want so-and-so. Nevertheless, even during the Middle Ages and even until the modern period in some Jewish communities, minors were indeed married off. So the question, if people could effect espousal through intercourse, a two-part process would not be necessary. Why not do it that way for efficiency? And this was Aisha's question. So that's not the method that the rabbis preferred. Their preferred method was a transfer of money, although the minimum sum was extremely small. They wanted people to sanctify marriages rather than just making them monetary and sexual transactions, and therefore they developed ritual, they developed blessings, both for espousal and for the nisuin, the cohabitation part, which was celebrated with parties and feasting. They wanted you to do it that way. Question, what in the world is usufruct? Usufruct means the profit that is earned by property. So it could be interest or profits from business or harvest or farmland. The father has to let those profits pile up. As long as the property was independently given to that daughter, he has to let the profits pile up. But the husband doesn't. The husband can use all the profits from the business, or the farmland, or whatever it was. So question, why would the husband get this right when the father doesn't have it? So the Mishnah is seeming to point us toward an answer because it lists all the husband's obligations. And in the Gemara on this Mishnah, they're going to quote a Baraita, a teaching from the time of the Mishnah that didn't make it into the Mishnah. And according to this Baraita, the entitlements to the wife's labor product, to what she finds, and to the usufruct from her property are what compensate the husband for his costly obligations to maintain her, to ransom her, and that's a big concern in the Talmud, needing to ransom people. And he has to bury her. So let me just say a word about the expense of burying, because Rabbi Yehuda in our Mishnah seems to be giving us minimum standards, bottom line standards. We don't have any other voice disagreeing with him on it, so we presume silence is consent. So even a very poor man has to provide 2 flute players minimum and 1 singer of funeral elegies. So the flutes represent the breath, and that's why they were common at Jewish funerals in ancient times. The elegy singers, sometimes you get crappy translations that translate this word mekonenot as wailing women. They didn't just stand there and wail. They were paid officiants like rabbis today. They were performance artists who sang orally composed, often personalized funeral poetry, solos, and call and response with the mourners. And the purpose was to elicit the mourners' tears. They were not into stiff upper lip. And what we learn from this is that music and funeral poetry were so important that nobody was supposed to be deprived of them for economic reasons. So, question, Aisha asked, well, doesn't the father have to maintain her? And the answer is legally only until age 6. But obviously, if he doesn't feed her, he's not going to get a labor product out of her, much less her spousal money. There is an option, however, and that is to sell her as an indentured Hebrew slave. If he did that, she'd work for a family, be fed and maintained by them, and at puberty, she was entitled to be married with a tubah, either to the master of the household or to one of his sons. But she was also legally empowered to refuse that marriage at puberty. And that's a process called miyun. So the motivations for the sale might be either that the father is too poor to maintain her, or to make an advantageous marriage for her, so he gets her into the situation where she'll be decently fed and also have a better marriage that he could make for her. Or one scholar has suggested that maybe she'd been raped, and the sale allows the father to recoup his financial investment, because if he waited until puberty and married her, because she was not a virgin, her ketubah would be only half that of a virgin. Question, does the father have to ransom her? We know a husband does. What about the father? Also Aisha's question. Actually, the Gemara argues about that. So one view is he would ransom her without being obligated. The other view says, hey, she's got property of her own that doesn't belong to the father. Let her get ransomed through that property. Another question, what if the woman would rather maintain herself and retain her own usufruct? Well, according to the Gemara, she could refuse his maintenance and keep her usufruct. Now, if the woman was independently wealthy and a great businesswoman, that would work for her. And there are 2 examples in the Gemara of women who do this, but it probably wouldn't have worked for most wives at the time. Question, what's all this about the power to annul her vows? Why would they care? The answer is that vows are taken very seriously in this culture. They have to be fulfilled. A husband or father can annul a wife's or daughter's vows when they hear them, but otherwise only a Jewish court can annul vows. So vows could be a source of power and control for women. A woman could vow not to get any pleasure out of sex, or to become a Nazirite for X amount of time and drink no wine and shave her head. And these are mentioned by the Gemara as very annoying vows that women could take. Apparently, the men of that time did not find shaven heads attractive.
Okay, so can you hear me? Am I? Yeah. Okay, so one of the things that we did in this chapter also that we're not going to be sharing with you right now, just because we want to make sure we have time for discussion, is that we commented in the same question and answer way on each other's texts. So we actually, when you read the chapter, you can look at the different questions that arose for Rachel and for I when we were reading the Islamic legal text versus the Jewish legal text. So, and then what we do is we move on into this section where we think about what did we gain from this exchange? Like Rachel, graciously came to Vancouver for about 4 days, and we spent 4 days studying these 2 texts together. And so we had an extended period of, time to sit and think and discuss these texts. So the question that came up for us at the end of it was, what did I learn about my own text from this conversation? Is there something that I can, capture in writing? And so that's what we tried to do. So I'll share that with you, and then Rachel will share what she learned with you, and then we will go back and ask some meta questions about this exercise. What can we gain from feminists reading religious legal texts across the Islamic and Jewish legal traditions? Although both texts are inherently patriarchal, discussing the control that a father and or guardian or a husband has over his wife, we have to ask if reading these texts side by side introduces new hermeneutical options for religious feminists. The conception of emption, marriage pre-consummation, which is found in the Jewish legal text, is not present in the Islamic legal text under study. What if we were to think of the nikah in this text as emption, rather than consummated marriage. This might be a useful exercise because it significantly changes the tone of the passage, softening some of its harsher edges. If nikah is understood as emption alone, then this means that minors can be married off by non-agnate guardians only in emption. By the time they reach the age of maturity, though they are married, they can now choose to annul the marriage. Seen in this light, the patriarchy of the law of minors is softened because it does not involve unwanted sex on the part of the minor, if the marriage is only emption. Of course, this does not solve the problem of the agnate guardian marrying off the minor, since this marriage cannot be simply nullified or annulled. Similarly, in the case of the disturbing ruling that a woman's silence counts as her consent, if nikah is emption rather than a consummated marriage, this again reduces the power of the guardian over the virgin. Although he can coerce her into a marriage contract, this contract does not necessarily result in unwanted sex, which, to be clear, is rape, nor can a guardian actually force the virgin to stay with her husband. Rather, a woman can deny that she was silent, and her word takes precedence over her husband's claims to her consent through silence. So while this text undeniably empowers the male guardian over their female charges, it also grants women some measure of agency by allowing them to nullify their marriage if they were married by a non-agnate guardian, or by claiming that they never consented to the marriage to begin with. Applying the concept of emption to nikah removes some of the negative consequences that would emerge for a minor or a virgin between the period of marriage and her claim to either nullify her marriage or request of divorce. Of course, this does not eliminate the problem of male guardianship, and I know I keep harping on it, but I am saying it on purpose, over women and their ability to marry them off with or without their consent. But it does allow us to imagine a tangible improvement in the lives of the women constrained by these laws, whether in the past or in the present.
Aisha,
So,
forgot to turn this back on. Is it on now?
No.
All right, is it on now?
Yeah.
Great. Okay. Aisha, at the end of your conclusions, you asked
so I think you're going to read this one.
you asked some questions that I think I would like you to repeat because they were so important, I think.
Okay. But I think you were gonna, okay. So, did you want to read your further reflection first? Do you want to read your further reflection first? Okay, I'll do the conclusion. Okay, so moving on to the conclusion. So in terms of like further reflecting on this exercise, we grounded our discussion of this paper in Alistair MacIntyre's description of tradition as an embodiment of ongoing disagreement. During the workshopping of this paper, many of us were drawn to the metaphor of play to describe our engagement with our own and each other's texts. We felt like we were playing with these texts, in the sense that playing denotes active engagement in a game with set rules, where we respect the rules of the game to engage in play. This play is meant to be well-intentioned, built on allegiances to similar goals, and meant to foster camaraderie in pursuit of those goals. The metaphor of play acknowledges that in the Jewish and Islamic traditions, we use similar strategies in our relationships with the texts of our own traditions, and it creates a space for us to engage each other's texts. Play allows us to feel ownership over the process of interfaith reading and engagement with each other's sacred texts and traditions, recognizing them at once different but also familiar. As we conclude this chapter of thoughtful and diligent reading of each other's and our own legal texts about the procedures of marriage, we have to ask some difficult questions. When religious feminists read patriarchal religious legal texts, are we playing the same game as the key figures in our traditions? And if so, do we want to be playing this game? Can new participants who would be shunned by the tradition enter the conversation and make constructive changes to that tradition? If tradition is the embodiment of ongoing disagreement, what are the limits of acceptable disagreement? At what point does a disagreement extend beyond the boundaries of tradition and become unsustainable? As women who enter the conversation of patriarchal religious traditions, we are already participating in a conversation in which we would have been unwelcome, undervalued, and in many instances forbidden from participating. As feminists, our central values about the equality of the genders is fundamentally at odds with the basic assumptions of the text that we have read together with you today, which build on and support the privileging of men over women. Given this fact, how exactly does our conversation add to the tradition? In taking the tradition apart, unearthing its assumptions, and sustaining clearly what was thinkable and unthinkable in its framework, how exactly do we impact the conversation of the tradition? Is it possible to change the tradition constructively from within, or do we seek to replace this tradition with another? Can our patriarchal legal traditions be salvaged? In this chapter, even as we break the confines of our traditions, by the very act of reading, speaking, and engaging with these traditions as feminists and as the other, our readings are still committed to working within the logical constraints of our traditions. You notice us both doing that in a painstaking manner with each of our texts, like thinking about what is usufruct, what are these legal scholars and minds, how are they thinking, what are the mechanics of how this works out? We diligently unpack texts in which women are defined by their sexual value and economic worth to men, where normative marriage is an economic transaction in which women have little to no agency. What does it mean to engage our traditions respectfully in this context? In our bid to respect the integrity of our traditions, do we also necessarily disrespect the integrity of living women, ourselves included? Does our respectfulness stop us from pushing further, demanding that women's humanity be recognized by these texts? And what does it do to us and our worth in our own eyes to try to figure out all the intricate details of a legal framework that ultimately denies our worth and disempowers us? Do we inherently disrespect ourselves when we respect the tradition? Two central questions this exercise raises are, first, can patriarchal legal traditions be saved so that they can be read in gender equal ways that no longer do violence and injustice to women? And second, should we be trying to save these texts in the first place?
Aisha, my teacher, Eliezer Berkovitz, may his memory be blessed, used to say, I'd rather have a good question than a bad answer. And I so honor how you're able to ask good questions. Aisha has raised powerful questions about the nature and legitimacy of feminist engagement with traditions. It's possible to use McIntyre's definition of a tradition to enforce a very conservative praxis. It's also possible to use it to explain how change can occur in traditions, and that's how I choose to use it. If traditions, unless they're moribund, are supposed to be fluid, and if new participants in conversations change the conversation, as I've argued, then it becomes possible for women who join this conversation to do more than merely understand ancient legal texts about marriage. Instead, women with their new narratives about marriage and their aspirations to gender justice acquire the power to change law. Law is changeable by definition. It governs the behavior of mutable human beings in mutable socio-historical contexts.
all legal systems contain mechanisms for change. That's why law needs to be interpreted. The question is, who gets to engage in interpretation and who gets to make or amend the ground rules for interpretation? What I believe women can do when talking their way into a conversation is, one, to appropriate the authority to become interpreters. Two, to challenge legal categories that were constructed without their input and that disadvantage them. And three, to negotiate new rules of meta discourse so it becomes possible to converse about and alter the existing rules of interpretation when necessary. In my opinion, Kiddushin marriage is not a viable way for an egalitarian Judaism to contract marriages. By definition, it's a way for men to acquire women as possessions, and I would be happy to see the entire legal category of Kiddushin and of get, divorce, that is de-acquisition of women, uprooted or legislated into impracticability, as several other Jewish legal categories have been. So, I have created and promulgated a different way of marrying. A way that's, instead of being rooted in Talmudic property law, is rooted in Talmudic partnership law. And I called it the Lover's Covenant, the Brit HaLevi. And it relies on a minority legal opinion in the Talmud that maintains that there are permitted relationships that are not Kiddushin marriage and not fornication. And it uses precedents for customized contracts and ways for women to initiate divorce proceedings that have precedence in Palestinian ketubot from the Cairo Geniza. Cairo Geniza, you know what a Geniza is? A Geniza is a document dump. And this particular one was found in a Cairo synagogue, and it covered material that was from the 6th century to the 13th century. So I created a ceremony and a contract that can be customized for straight or LGBTQ couples. It's widely available on the internet. Either partner has the power to dissolve the partnership. There are complications, there are status questions that arise. I'm very willing to talk about them with you. But there's a tradition, there are several women in Talmud who do things that I've described as being legal guerrillas. They conduct a kind of guerrilla warfare using their legal knowledge. I think becoming a legal guerrilla is definitely an option. And I hope that there will be legal guerrillas in both our legal traditions of the whole variety of genders, and that we'll keep on creating more and more legal solutions.
Thank you very much. And on that wonderfully hopeful note, in which I have to say that in this entire experience of having the honor, I mean, I actually read Rachel's work also in graduate school, and I was extremely inspired by it. So the idea of working on this project with you and writing with you was a tremendous honor that I could never have dreamed of or imagined. And I have learned so much in this process. And the thing that I've learned the most, and I've been inspired by the most, is Rachel's ability to maintain hope, even though, you know, she remembers a time, as she was saying just earlier today, when there were no female rabbis at all. And yet she is so hopeful and filled with wonder, and that really inspires me. Thank you.
Thank you.
Is it on? It is. So you'll take some questions? Yes? When you have a question, if you could raise your hand and I'll bring the microphone to you so that we can everybody can hear it, and we can also get it on our camera for on the audio at least for our online students so that they can hear it too. I'm going to exercise privilege of the coordinator to ask the first question. Letty Cotton Pogrebin, a second wave Jewish feminist, once remarked that she felt like a double agent amongst the feminists and the religious scholars, neither of which believed the other was likely to get to heaven. That's the way she described it. And I'm wondering if you could share with us, from a personal perspective, why you engage these two discourses. I think for many of us here, at least in this context of America and the CTS context, the feminist one might be more obvious. So if you could belabor the other one a little more, why bother to engage these texts and these traditions?
I think it was the philosopher George Santayana who remarked that it is as impossible to practice religion as it is to speak language. It always is something specific. There's a vocabulary that belongs to us. There are texts that belong to us. There are rituals that belong to us. None of these things are static because we go back to them, we re-understand them, we keep transforming them. And yet, it seems important that that they maintain some kind of integrity. For me, these texts are holy. That doesn't mean that I like everything they say. For me, a legal system is, as the legal scholar Robert Cover suggested, a bridge. What I'm looking at is one end of the bridge. I have to decide where the bridge ought to go. And it's not just the text that's holy, it's the process that I go through when I engage with the text and decide where it needs to go. That's holy. And that's not just an individual process, it's a communal process. I think that is a difference between Aisha's and my traditions and your Christian tradition. For you, I have the sense that it's more individual than it is communal. And of course, the notion of having a legal tradition is not, that's not you. You don't come from a legal tradition. So that's a kind of additional layer of having to stretch yourself to imagine something that really isn't part of your own religious vocabulary.
So, so religious feminists occupy a very, as I mentioned in the paper as well, an impossible space and they're not feminist enough, and they're not religious enough, and they have to sort of constantly fight to stake claim and authority to both of those spaces. And that's something that all religious feminists have to deal with. And in various religious contexts, you deal with that in different ways, right? So, whether depending on how politicized or not your tradition is. I mean, in the Islamic tradition right now, Islam is very politicized, and Muslim women are especially politicized. So it doesn't matter what you put on your body or how little you put on, it always has a million meanings for people that you're not really engaging in, that are all these sub-conversations that are happening when I'm sitting up here talking about this text, this 11th century text, right? So that's something that I'm always very aware of. And in terms of I teach a class called Religious Feminisms at UBC, at the University of British Columbia, and I really love teaching this class, and I tell my students about this. When I introduce them to the class, I tell them, okay, look, when when modern Western citizens of Canada, in this case, come to religious texts, I mean, as if they're coming to it in a vacuum, but they're not. But when they come to religious texts and they realize the patriarchy of religious texts, they have several choices in front of them. At one extreme is the idea to say, this is patriarchal. Like, this is, how can this ever serve my needs? This is not good enough. So I'm going to walk away from it and live a secular life and not be religious. On the other end of that extreme, there is the response to say, I feel like the patriarchy of this tradition is unjust, but I'm just like this little person who doesn't really know very much. And so maybe I should just trust the centuries-old tradition and scholarship on this issue. They really must have known better about what they were saying than I do, and so I should just submit to this text in an uncritical way. And my course is designed for the people in between those two positions, who are not choosing to fully submit, who are not willing to give up their own understandings of justice and gender equality, but who are also not willing to walk away from their religious tradition. And the thing about religious traditions is that they form your identity. I am Muslim. Like, I cannot not be Muslim. Even if I converted to another religion, I would still have a Muslim lens with which I would see the world. I cannot stop doing that. And so, I'm not willing, and also I'm not willing to give up, and I think this is something that a lot of religious feminists say, we're not willing to give up our religion and our tradition and this identity to the most conservative expressions of that tradition. That other expressions of Islam are or in this case, in my conversation, Islam, are just as authentic and just as intrinsically religious as a more conservative expression of that tradition. And so I guess what religious feminists are doing is they're staking their claim, and they're saying, you know what, I belong in this house too, and no, I will not go through the side door to this back room. I'm gonna be in the living room, and I'm gonna hang out here. Now, right? So that's where the conversation happens. Yeah.
Christian has the mic, so raise your hand if you want to ask a question, and he'll hand it to one of you.
I'm so excited. Two comments, actually. What you're expressing in sociological and political science is a theory going back to the early 60s, I think it was, called exit, voice, or loyalty. And what you're expressing is the voice, which is gratifying, because I chose the exit a long time ago and came back, but exit was my expression of my femininity against Judaism. And it was, I couldn't deal with it, so I left. So I do appreciate it. The question I have, though, is the comparison of the 2 points of view from the text. Did you choose those 2 portions separately by just saying, I want to deal with marriage, or something else? Because it sort of strikes me that the Jewish text deals with contracts, while the Islam text is dealing more with how you can or cannot choose marriage or not choose marriage. So you took the same area of marriage, but chose very different conceptual points of view. Could you both answer that, I guess? Thank you.
Well, so we did select the texts, first of all. We did select them. And when we were looking for texts, we were thinking about, we actually thought, let's have a text on marriage. And we didn't narrow it down to even the marriage of minors when we were thinking about it. But we both stumbled across these very interesting texts about the procedure of marrying minors, which is the overlapping conceptual theme. And I think the difference in terms of contrast and in terms of the issue of consent and virginity in the other one, very much reflect the very different legal discussions around the procedure for marrying minors that are intrinsic to those traditions. And we sort of let those stand as they were instead of artificially trying to find something about contracts and marriage in that very specific way in Islam. Yeah.
I think Aisha's text dealt with consent because Aisha's text is about the marriage of women who are legally adult. My text is about the marriage of women who are not legally adult. It focuses on how marriage expresses itself in 200 CE as an economic relationship. Marriage in the 21st century is still an economic arrangement. It's just we get embarrassed about talking about that part. Instead, we don't even know what each other is bringing into the marriage, and we don't know often what each other thinks about money until we're already married, and then we start to fight about it. So this is a different concern. As far as the ketubah is concerned, the ketubah is not a contract that effectuates marriage. It is a contract that limits that gives men a certain amount of responsibility concerning the disposal of women's financial resources and their own financial resources. And when the rabbis enacted these things, they made the assumption that they were protecting women. And certainly, it's a lot better than a system in which the guy could divorce you and leave you penniless. So maybe, but both of us, I think, are talking about things that are kind of taboo. And we don't like to think about that much of the history of women, that's how things were. But that is how it was. That's not going to go away.
Hello? Okay. Hi, my name is Stephanie. My question is, what was your biggest challenge in analyzing the text? Did you find yourself analyzing from a modern perspective, or were you more empathetic to the times that the ancient text was created?
I think we had to do both, don't you?
Yeah, I would
we had to have some kind of understanding of what the people who created the text were thinking. We had to try to imagine what life was like for the women who inhabited those conditions. And then we had our own set of questions from where we stand.
And I would just add to that, I mean, yeah, like, so I definitely think that, you know, we can't stop being who we are when we're reading these texts. We can never put that on hold. We can never be like, oh, for this, you know, exercise, I'm going to enter a vacuum and not be socially historically located, right? We're always who we are. We can never stop that, even though people might, I think people in every tradition want to pretend that they can stop that and really get to the real meaning of the text. They actually can't do that. And so, and I think that's an important point to keep in mind. So what I was doing, what we were doing that question and answer exercise was trying to say, okay, we're going to try to think about what questions this text is asking and trying to answer. What questions is trying to answer and how is it answering them? And that's why the commentary was like in a separate italicized section underneath that I was reading to you. So it was question, answer, and then my commentary. At the bottom. That's why I read it like that, because I was trying to separate them as much as possible, but you of course can't. And I think that the very fact that my questions were different than the 13th century scholar indicate that, right? That we're seeing the text answering different questions. And the other thing to keep in mind, I think, for the Islamic text especially, is that even though this text was written in the 13th century and it was influential, it's not that it stopped being influential entirely, right? I mean, many Muslim countries, Muslim majority countries that purport to follow Sharia law use some of these texts, often wholesale import them in their family law sections. And so countries like the UAE have all these laws around, you know, marriage and divorce and the way that you acquire, about the marriage of minors, underage marriage, all sorts of things. And the UAE actually in this case, they do have a minimum marriage age, but in Yemen they don't. So it depends on how it's instituted in each nation state, and it's very different, it's very varied. But nevertheless, they deeply influence state legislation in family law. And so they deeply influence the way the real lives of women in the world today. And so it's important to understand the power of these texts beyond simply a text of the 11th century that nobody might be reading anymore. And I would say that, I mean, Rahal can comment on this more, but, you know, even having these texts in our tradition, even if they're not, you know, imported into a legislature, they are nevertheless, if they are in circulation, if they're being read in a regular way, they influence mores about how gender is constructed and what appropriate norms are in all sorts of unmeasurable ways. So, and I think that's one of the reasons why we were really spending time reading these texts that seemed, you know, potentially too detailed and possibly boring, because they are still influential, right?
I think you probably touched on my question about precedence and whether or not either of the two tribunals would have any true allegiance to those texts as they are written at this present moment. But just to go a bit deeper, and if you would just tell us, she gave us, I believe, some ages for what would have been considered a minor. But if you both could talk about what was the age of majority, how did you decide who was an adult? Because neither of the texts do that. And then the follow-up to that would be, given how the world is going now, particularly as we see young girls being abducted and taken in under claims of some type of Islamic faith, how much do you believe this kind of work now needs to be really just galvanized, because it opens the door to our capacity to sort of be the other voice, if you will?
So the age in the text, so there's no age in the text, and majority is reached at puberty. So minority is before puberty, to answer that in a straightforward way. In terms of, you know, so there's no good way to answer this question. Well, maybe there is. Okay, so in terms of the question of religion and politics, which is something that's deeply intertwined, we have to, I think, always remember that with organizations, I mean, let's just make it real, like Boko Haram or ISIS, when we're thinking of these organizations, these are primarily political organizations that have emerged in a political vacuum created by foreign policy that, Western nation states, including the US especially, are responsible for. And so when these religious groups when these political groups use religious rhetoric to galvanize and to justify the morality of their behavior, it is important to take those claims seriously and not pretend like that they're not making those claims, or not to discount them as completely empty, but at the same time to take them seriously alongside recognizing the political nature of their organization and the circumstances that have led to them having power. So what I'm basically saying is it is important to take their claims seriously while also accepting responsibility and taking accountability for our own contributions to the situation. But in terms of thinking about the religious discourse alone, isolating that for a second, of course it can never be fully isolated. I think that groups like ISIS especially are a moment for introspection, for internal Muslim dialogue, because it's forcing Muslims to have conversations that they might have sort of felt like were not as urgent, and to say, what role do these texts play? What are we supposed to do with these texts? And if we want to make them impractical and we want to legislate them out of any function, we should really, do that in a more earnest way, and it should be a much more acceptable practice within the larger Muslim. There's 1.3 billion Muslims, so there is not one Muslim community. There are many, many different diverse Muslim communities, but across the board, I think it's fine, and there have been Muslim reformists who have been arguing for reforming these laws or changing the way we think about tradition for decades in the Muslim world, and throughout history, but especially in the last few decades. And I think that, groups like ISIS are finally, because of their claims, people are finally giving some attention, and much needed attention and respect and authority to the voice of reformists that has been there within the Muslim community for the entire time. So it really is a space, and Muslims are engaged in very vital and contentious, sometimes intra-Muslim conversation, and that conversation is continuing and is heightened only in urgency by the political situation. Thank you.
I want to thank you both for your contributions and being here tonight. I think it's awesome that you're both here sharing your faith traditions. My first question is for you, Rabbi. Who was David that you dedicated your book to in Engendering Judaism? Who was David?
David was my second husband.
Okay. I did not. I know there was something, I think, in Hebrew after it, so I didn't understand what that was. What is your message for extreme fundamentalists within Christianity, Islam, and Judaism? What is your message to them for change and transformation and hope?
My message is that all of the books that they are saying speak with a single voice are in fact multivocal. In my texts, it's all obvious. Talmud is a bunch of people arguing with one another. But of course, the Hebrew Bible is also a bunch of people arguing with one another. I try to imagine them somewhere, in the next world, maybe in a room like this, and you walk in and it's deafening. Because in one corner, there's Leviticus is having a big argument with songs. Leviticus is saying, human fluids, yuck. And songs is saying, what do you mean? They're like wine, they're like honey, they're delicious. In another corner, Ruth is having a big fight with Ezra. Ezra is saying, foreign women, get them out of here. And Ruth is saying, where do you think the Messiah's coming from? And then you have all of the prophets, and they're all different, and they come from different places. Some of them are aristocrats, some of them are tree trimmers. There are all kinds of different people. They have all kinds of different messages. You have the wisdom literature, where it's addressed to these upper class young guys. Be prudent, young man, and serve your king well. And then you have Job that overturns that whole tradition and all its prudence and says it's not enough. It doesn't help. Wisdom is really something else. It's all arguments, but arguments are blessed. That's where truth comes from. Truth is in little shards all over the place, and in the arguments you get pieces that are right on both sides. So when you try to squish that all into a single voice, you're stomping on the holy.
That was great.
So I'm really struck with this idea of like talking about playing with traditions, because my Talmud teacher at B'nai Lappi, who does a lot of B'tei Midrash all around Chicago, is all about creating players in the Jewish tradition, and I think it's so important. And I think it's something that we miss, because everyone's like, oh, we all have to be experts about this. And that's not what our traditions are about. It's about really learning and playing with it. But I'm really curious, Aisha, I'm wondering if in Islamic legal tradition there's sort of a similar idea of that basically you need to know everything in order to be able to know the context. I know that that the rabbis they value consent in sexual relations a lot. And so rape, as we understand it, may not have been a thing for them and in their sort of conceptual world. So I'm wondering if there's any sort of understanding like that in Islamic legal tradition.
So in terms of, okay, so as best I understand that question, thank you for the question. I think that, it depends on who's playing the game, right? If we think of it as a game, like interpretation as a game and players, it depends on who's setting the rules of the game. There are some people who say, you need to know so much stuff, and then when you ask them what it is, it's usually whatever they know. They're 20 years having done this, know this many languages, know this much tradition, having studied it for this long. So, but other people will say, no, you can be part of the conversation because you're part of the tradition. And furthermore, I think what complicates us further, if we especially think about religion intertwined with politics, is that once religion enters the political arena, then it becomes a matter of public policy. The Musawa, an organization that fights for Muslim women's rights in Muslim-majority countries, makes this argument. Zaina Anwar makes this argument all the time. She's like, I get to be part of this conversation about religious reform because we're talking about public policy, right? So then it sort of opens a playing field even more. So you acknowledge the porous boundaries of religion, and that anyone affected by it can be a participant in the conversation around it. And so, depending on what context you're in, different people will say different things. And think about studying the Quran in a mosque versus the university. That's a good example of how the rules are different, the people who get to participate in the rules are different, so context makes a huge difference in terms of how you set those rules.
We have time for one more.
Hi. I'm just trying to get a better grasp of understanding some of this wordings. It seems like to me how the definition of sane versus insane seems like a really big criteria to define. And I know that even in modern time now, we have a difficulty in defining who's sane and who's insane. And for women, this is such a huge loophole. Like one moment you can be sane, one moment you can be defined as insane when you're not following my rule. So how does that change? What are the criteria to define you as sane or insane, depending on the time period that you're in, and how has that changed to this time now? It seems like a very subjective way to define this, and we still have trouble defining who's sane and who's insane, and the criteria keeps changing, and so I just want to know how and in some cases, have you seen any loopholes where this was used against women when they don't follow your rule? You're like, oh, she's insane, class or whatever.
I think that's a great question, and that's an example of the kinds of questions that different people ask of the text. So that's a question I actually never asked when I was reading the text, even though I spent all this time thinking about it. That's a great question that you're able to bring up. And I think you're right, sanity is subjective, and what is reasonable is subjective and culturally relative, and so that changes over time. And you can imagine whoever is defining it wields great authority.
So we're going to end on the ambiguity of sanity. That might be apt for this context, I don't know. I want to thank you both very much. And thank you to all of you for coming out this evening.